everyone. As I said, I'm really excited to be here and talking to you all, at least virtually. So I'm going to share with you for the next 25 minutes or so some of the work that I get up to, which hopefully will be exciting and interesting for you. And then I'm also really looking forward to hearing what you guys have all been working on during the STEMATIX Labs so far. So I'm going to be talking about two topics which you probably are not super familiar with. The first one is the earth sciences, and the second one is a much more narrow discipline called hydrogeophysics, which, as Sindhu kind of introduced, is the field that I actually work in myself. So as we go along, I don't want this to be super formal, so if there's any questions or anything that's unclear, please feel free to shout out, or probably easiest is to put that in the chat, and I'll try and clarify things. I'm also going to hopefully leave a few minutes at the end for you to ask me any questions if there's anything you want to know more about. So let's go on to the next slide. So that being said, I was going to start by asking you guys all a question. So I'm hoping if we can go into the, if you hit participants in Zoom, you should be able to, if there's not a raise hand option, I think you'll find there's a little yes or no option. And just for my interest, could you put a yes or a no for whether you've studied earth sciences at school ever in your life? And that could be as a subject specifically, or maybe just as a small kind of part of a lesson or something. So I'm looking and I can see quite a few ticks coming through and a few raised hands. Awesome. Okay, that's really cool. And I would estimate, for those of you who can't see, probably about half of you actually, of the 17, have put hands up or said yes. So that's really cool. And that's actually more than I expected. So that's awesome. The next question, I put this as a poll, but I don't have the technological skills to make a poll in Zoom. So I just want you to think about this one. But this is, now I've got a much longer list of subjects that you might have studied. So here I have physics, chemistry, biology, math, geography, geology, material science, atmospheric science, and astronomy. And just think in your head, when have you studied any or all of these in your school career up till now? And I suspect that the answer is yes to a lot more of these, even than the 50% of you that said you've studied earth sciences. In fact, I expect that with math, probably everyone has studied math at school. So now I've got you thinking about yourselves, and I know a bit more about you. Who am I? Well, I'm an earth scientist. I suppose the first question is to clarify what exactly that means. So what do earth scientists do? Well, the earth sciences is a subject which is not often specifically taught at school, as we've just kind of discussed. But earth sciences use the science and math skills which you do learn at school, and we use these skills to explore the processes that occur on our planet. And that's this beautiful little orb shown here from space. So just to fly through the things I listed before: physics, chemistry, biology, math, geology, material science, atmospheric science, planetary science, astronomy, all of these subdisciplines, earth scientists kind of dabble in so many of these to try and understand and use the information from these subdisciplines to understand important questions about our planet. So I just have a few examples of the sort of things that we do study in the earth sciences, which some of you may know, and some of you they may be new ideas for some of you. So one of the things that we study is plate tectonics, and here I'm illustrating that with this beautiful picture of the Ridgecrest earthquake from last year in California. This is the fault scarp left by that damaging earthquake. And plate tectonics is really about how do things like these earthquakes occur, and why do they occur? And also investigating questions such as how damaging might they be, and how can we predict this damage? And plate tectonics isn't only limited to earthquakes, we also consider volcanoes, and many other problems besides. And just to illustrate the point, the study of plate tectonics uses physics to think about the forces acting on the plate. So what's pushing and pulling and creating these earthquakes. We also use the discipline of geology to understand what the Earth is made up of. So what it is that's being exposed to forces. And then the discipline of material science, where we look at the properties and the strength of these of the Earth, to see how it will respond in reaction to the forces applied to it, and when those forces will result in damaging earthquakes. So another topic that earth scientists study, which is of crucial importance to the world in the coming decades, and in fact years, is climate change. And climate change is, the earth scientist studies climate change in two ways. First of all, there's something you might be familiar with, which is looking at the present situation. So looking at how the dynamics of our oceans and atmosphere combine to create changes in the climate. But there's also another aspect which earth scientists think about, which is how things have happened in the past. And if there are clues in terms of understanding our climate, which we can gain from looking at things that happened in the past. And by the past, I don't necessarily mean the near past, the human past within 100 years. I'm talking about things which have happened thousands or maybe even millions of years ago in geologic time, and seeing if we can find analogs for current climate change to better help us understand what might happen in the future. And in climate science, we're using physics, we're using chemistry, and we're using math, and kind of some combination of these, which we might refer to as atmospheric and climate sciences, which you'll probably have heard of or will be at least familiar with. What might be surprising is to think about that in climate change, we actually also need to study astronomy, because the interaction, the orbit of the Earth around the sun varies over long timescales. And this can be important in the context of climate change, particularly over thousands and tens of thousands of years. So the final example I wanted to give is the very broad subject that earth scientists study called environmental science, which is very relevant for this summer school. And here I've got a picture of some environmental scientists. In fact, this is a team I was a part of working in the Peruvian Andes. And you can tell we're high up in the Andes because this river that we're trying to analyze, the water is actually frozen, which was something we had not accounted for. So we spent a significant portion of our day bashing through the ice in order to probe the water. But what I actually want to draw your attention to in this photo is the color of the water. And it's slightly difficult to make it out because of the bed of the river. But this water is actually not clear. It has a kind of reddish tinge to it. Maybe you can see that more clearly in the main stream here. And the reason for that is the water is being contaminated by iron coming off a mine, which is upstream. And this is a classic problem of environmental science where human impacts or human activities have caused impacts on our water supplies. And of course, environmental science considers more than just our water supplies. It considers human impacts on life, on biology, on the soil, on the atmosphere, and many other aspects of the Earth system. So in environmental science, we're using things like chemistry to understand what chemicals have gone into the rivers or other aspects of the Earth system. We're understanding biology. We're using biology to understand how this has an impact on living, things within our planet. And we use geology to understand where these chemicals may have come from in the first place. And of course, we use math to tie all of this together and create models for how things might occur in the future. So just a little bit more background on earth scientists. We are such a privileged group in that we get to work in these three settings, and in particular, we get to work in the field, which is the most amazing place. We get to go out there into this planet and gather data and make observations to really understand what's going on. But as well as that, we go back to the lab, where we'll perhaps perform more detailed analysis on some of the samples that we may have collected or on the data that we've gathered. And we also spend plenty of time working on computers using advanced software to process data and run models to understand how our planet is operating. So that's a lot about earth sciences in general. What about me specifically? Well, I introduced before that I am actually a hydrogeophysicist. So what does that mean? It certainly seems a bit of a mouthful. Well, we can break that down quite nicely into three parts. The first part is the physicist, which is the tool that I use. So I'm interested in using, or in my work, I use the tool of physics. The second part is hydro, and hydro means water. And that's kind of the object of my work. So I'm studying water. And the third part of this horribly complicated word is, of course, geo. And geo means about the earth. And that's the location of the water I'm looking at. And in fact, more often than not, the water I look at is not on the surface of the earth, but it's actually underground in the earth's groundwater. And the other thing about me is that I would not want to do any other job in the entire world. Hopefully you can tell that I'm quite enthusiastic about the earth sciences and hydrogeophysics. And I hope that comes across because it really is an amazing field to work in. So that's kind of my intro on just the earth sciences and who I am. This presentation, I believe, is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. So if any of you are interested in more information, I've just put some links here, which you can't see especially well, but you'll be able to go back and look at them for some more cool information about the earth sciences and potentially how to get involved if you're interested in learning more about the earth sciences. And I'm also, I'll make my email available, and I'm happy to be contacted at the end of this talk if any of you have any questions or want more information. So to go into a bit more detail about exactly what I do in this hydrogeophysics, I'm going to show you probably about 15 minutes now of slides about my own my own work. Or I should say, this is kind of a collaborative effort, the work of the research group that I'm involved in. So we always like to start with this view of our planet taken from Apollo 17. And the first thing you notice, of course, is that Earth is incredibly blue. It is the blue planet. And you might be tempted to say that there is abundant water, or so it seems. However, perhaps it's not so abundant when you consider the 7 or so billion people living on this planet trying to use this water. And I want to ask a question to you also. Perhaps if you can try and put answers in the chat, it's probably the easiest way for me to see them. I want you to think about this question, which is, where on earth does the water we use come from? And by that, I mean, when you turn the tap on for washing or drinking or any other uses you might use water for, where is this water originally coming from? Which area of the earth? So I'm just going to give you a few moments to think about that. And if you want to, if you have any thoughts, just pop it into the chat. This is a question where there's no wrong answers. So I'm just really curious to see about which locations you think that your water might be coming from. Okay, great. I can see that Savesh has given us some ideas. I'm getting a few more. You can either message to everyone or to me privately is fine as well. Okay, awesome. These are all great suggestions. I'll just give you 1 or 2 more moments in case anyone's typing. Okay, great. So I think collectively you got the whole lot. So let me have a look. It was kind of a trick question in a way, because I've shown you this picture of the blue Earth. And of course, the thing that's most blue is the oceans. And someone has said in the chat that the oceans is one of the places where the water might come from. And it is in some aspects, but of course the ocean water is salty. And that's a problem. You don't want to drink salty water. You don't want to wash with salty water. And if you're growing crops, you don't want to put salty water for irrigation. So, so one suggestion that was made was that this water is of course filtered. And to remove salt from seawater is actually quite challenging. It takes a lot of energy and it's not easy to do. So typically the water that we use does not come from seawater, although there are a few notable exceptions where people do remove salt from seawater. However, what a lot of other suggestions have said is essentially this. So something along the lines of reservoirs or lakes or rivers as well. And this is basically our surface water, our surface fresh water, which we use to get a large amount of our water supply. However, a few of you, probably triggered by the introduction, correctly pointed out that there's another source of water, which we think about less commonly, which is, of course, groundwater. And this is the water which is stored beneath the ground in the open spaces in rocks and sediments under our feet. And these are referred to as groundwater aquifers. And you can see from the scale here, it does vary around the world, but in some places these extend hundreds or even thousands of meters deep. And what happens is you can drill a well down into the subsurface, and when it reaches an area where we have water in between the rocks and sediments, then that well will fill with water and you can pump that to the ground surface and use it for drinking, irrigation, or other purposes. Now, what may be surprising to you is that 97% of all liquid fresh water on the planet Earth is stored in groundwater. And that means that only 3% is stored in lakes and rivers and reservoirs. And the reason it's such a large percentage in the groundwater is because this extends so deep. You can go down hundreds to thousands of meters when you can still drill a well and find groundwater. Of course, in terms of getting this water, it's quite expensive to drill a well, and it's even more expensive to pump the water out to the surface. So the water that we use is usually a mix of fresh water from the groundwater and fresh water from the surface. And in some places, this mix is about 50%, but often it's more common still to use reservoirs and lakes than it is to get water from the groundwater. However, there's one place in particular where this balance goes the other way. And many of you will be from California and will be familiar with this. For those who aren't, this is a map of California. And here we have this large, flat, green kind of elongate area. This is the Central Valley of California. And the Central Valley of California is a hugely productive agricultural area. And it's also somewhere where the rainfall is quite limited. And in the Central Valley, we're growing an incredible number of crops, including dairy products, pistachios, nuts, grapes and rice, tomatoes, vegetables. I have a list here, which I'm reading from, oranges and other tree fruits, and of course, almonds, which is what's pictured on the right here. And in fact, fun fact, which is that if you are anywhere in the world and you eat an almond, it's more likely than not that you will have found it was grown in California's Central Valley. Because 80% of the world's almonds are grown right here in this valley in California, which is incredible, 80%. Anyway, all of this agriculture requires a huge amount of water. And as I said before, the rain is limited, and there's actually nowhere near enough water in lakes and reservoirs to allow for all this agriculture. So what happens is, well, this picture is not to scale, haha, but we do indeed pump a large amount of groundwater in California to irrigate all of our agriculture. And how much is a large amount? Well, almost 2/3 of water used in the Central Valley comes from groundwater, which is much more than used in average around the world. However, another thing which is known about California is that it's subject to frequent droughts. And in droughts, of course, the levels of water in our reservoirs and lakes drop. And at that time, even less of our water can come from surface water. And in some severe droughts, 90% of water used in the Central Valley comes from pumping out of the ground. Now, this causes some problems. And essentially, we're not doing this sustainably at the moment in California. And here are five aspects in which the groundwater extraction is not sustainable, as identified by the California Department of Water Resources. And essentially, the biggest problem is that groundwater is not how should I say this? Groundwater is a renewable water source in the sense that when it rains at the surface, some of that rain percolates down through the soil into the groundwater and replenishes the groundwater that may have otherwise been pumped. However, this is a balance of water percolating down versus water being pumped out by us. And in California, this balance is way out. And the amount we're pumping is so much more than the amount which is percolating down. And this means that water levels, the depth you have to drill to reach water, gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And wells go dry, and you have to drill more and more expensive deep wells. And this is a great problem. It also means that if we continue in the way we're going, at some point, this will drop right to the bottom in this picture, which will mean it will have essentially run out of groundwater. And that will be hugely problematic for agriculture. It'll also be problematic for people living in the Central Valley who use a much smaller amount of water than the farmers do, but obviously they're using it for their livelihoods, for their daily needs, which is much more important in many ways than agriculture. Another problem you get is land subsidence, which is the land sinking. And what essentially happens is that when you pump water out of the ground, the space where this water used to be is no longer there. It's no longer filled with water, so it compacts and the land at the surface sinks. And this causes huge amounts of damage. Here are some bridges being damaged by the land subsidence. And this is a very expensive problem in California as well. So hydrogeophysics, we're all about developing methods to better manage this resource. And the problem is it's particularly hard to manage it because it's something you can't see. How do you manage something you can't see? It's deep underground and you can't get at it. And here in this picture I'm showing, this is the level of the water table in this imaginary picture. And it's all saturated with water below here and extends for hundreds of meters. Now, although we can't see it, we have a fairly good idea of what's going on down there. And particularly important is that some places in the subsurface are made up of clay and some places are made up of sand and gravel. Now, in the world of groundwater, sand and gravel is great. This is where we can pump water quite happily and water will flow readily from sand and gravel. However, clay is a much thicker and claggier sort of material. And it's much harder, if not impossible, to pump any water out of clay. What's more, clay actually acts as a barrier to the water. So in this process I described before of water percolating down, if it encounters clay, it stops percolating and doesn't actually replenish the groundwater. So it's really important in terms of better using this resource to identify where we have clay and where we have sand and gravel. So one way we can do this is drill a hole in the ground and have a look to see where sand and gravel and where there is clay. And of course, this works really well in the location where you look. So here you've drilled a hole and you go sand, 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 and you get to a certain point and you find clay, 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 and you know exactly what's there. Of course, you only know exactly what's there in the place where you drill the well. In between the wells, you have a great deal of uncertainty. That's where our science comes in. And we have a technology which is called the airborne electromagnetic method. And a lot of the research in our research group has been trying to understand better how this works and pioneering it and developing it for application in California. And essentially what you end up doing, this is a helicopter-based technique. You deploy a helicopter with this huge loop attached underneath it. And using that, you can image the subsurface to a depth of 100 to 400 meters. Now, this requires a bit of physics. For interest of time, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. So please don't worry if you don't understand this or everything about this, but this is how it works. So we fly our helicopter over the ground and we flow a current through this loop, much like a current in an electrical circuit. Now, what happens when you flow a current in a loop is you generate a magnetic field. So here we have a magnetic field generated, which goes into the earth. Now it starts to get a bit more complicated. This magnetic field going into the earth in turn creates currents flowing in the earth itself. So these are much smaller currents going in, little eddy currents. And the strength of these currents depends on how resistive, electrically resistive the earth is. These currents in turn induce another magnetic field, and we measure this in our helicopter. And based on the measurements we make, we can determine how resistive or how conductive the ground was. Now that's all well and good, and the result that we get is a map here showing where the ground is conductive and where the ground is resistive. The magic comes because we happen to know from work that we've done in the laboratory that places which are conductive tend to be clay, and places which are resistive tend to be sand and gravel. So in our research, we use these helicopter data to identify locations of clay and locations of sand and gravel in the subsurface. And we refer to this sometimes as mapping out the plumbing system. So here I have a video which will hopefully work. We'll see what happens. Okay, it's looking promising. You probably can't hear the sound. This is just illustrating a trial project that we did a few years ago where we actually used this technique for the first time in California. So here's the helicopter picking up the big loop and hopefully not picking up this gentleman at the same time. Here we have liftoff. If you can hear the sound, you could hear someone shouting woohoo at that moment. So here it's getting picked up. The local groundwater agency we worked at describe it as the world's largest fly swat. And you can just spot it here. Here is our helicopter zooming over the agricultural fields, making its data, collecting its data. So here is the result. So this is a map on Google Earth showing the location in the Central Valley. These colored lines on top are the data we collected. Now they're showing on top, but of course that's just for presentation purposes. The actual data is underneath the Earth's surface, so it's going underground. And here we can have the light colors, the cool colors, the blues. They represent areas which are conductive. And the dark colors here, the hot colors, sorry, the reds and oranges, these are areas which are resistive. So these are our sands and gravels. And you can see as I zoom in on this here, the colors convert. And excuse me if you can hear that rumbling, there's a thunderstorm going on here. Hopefully it's okay with my electricity. So here's the blues, which are now clay areas, and here are the oranges and yellows, which are sands and gravels. And when we showed this to our local partners that we've been working with, a couple of them were chuckling. And we asked afterwards, why did you chuckle when we showed you our results? And they said, well, as it happens, they just drilled a deep well that reached this yellow area, and they've been drilling down, 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 down. And they got to the yellow area and they found this huge amount of water that they could access. So they said, well, we already knew what you found, but we didn't know why. And they said that they'd found this water that they hadn't previously known was there. So this is one of the abilities of our technique, is to predict what's going on in the subsurface. Now, we're coming up a bit to time, so I'm just going to skip quickly. Actually, I'm going to skip over this, but I will just say that we're rolling out, or the state of California is rolling out this technology across the whole state to try and image the subsurface. And I want to finish up really on this slide, which is showing a bit more about our research group. So the research group I'm in is pioneered by this lady, Rosemary Knight, who is the most amazing, inspiring woman. She, if you think I seem excited about groundwater, then Rosemary's talks will blow your socks off. She is, if you are interested in more, I'd encourage you to Google her name, or sorry, to YouTube, search her name on YouTube, and there's a couple of great talks giving more information on this work. And I've just got a few pictures here showing some of the other things that we get up to in hydrogeophysics. This is a study in the Monterey coast, where again, we use a similar technique, this time measuring the resistivity using little electrodes, which are these, to image the damaging problem of saltwater intrusion coming in inshore. This bottom left one is showing a satellite, which is imaging the surface of the ground and really monitoring the land subsidence occurring in the California Central Valley at scales which are unprecedented. And this final picture shows a huge instrument we're putting into the ground here, where we're using a technique known as NMR to also understand what's going on in the subsurface. And with that, that's enough about my work. I'm going to hand over to you. So thank you for listening.